Well, I'm Ralf Blomqvist. I'm a management consultant, and my primary focus of interest and focus of expertise is relationship marketing and customer-driven strategy. So I've been doing that for quite a while. Way back when, I co-authored the first Nordic book on relationship marketing, and that was quite early on. And ever since, I've been working as a professional, helping organizations, companies to develop their customer relationships and their customer experiences in order to be more competitive or more cost efficient, and of course, first and foremost, do a better job for their customers. So that's what I've been doing for quite some time now. My projects tend to vary quite a lot. Right now I'm working a lot with the public sector. I work with a large major city in Finland with their city planning departments on how to improve the customer experience. I also work with a museum where we're thinking about how to reinvent the whole notion of what a museum is and what a museum should do with its customers. So that's a lot of public sector engagement right now, but our big clients, some of which are in Sweden because we're actually Gothenburg based, are within banking, insurance, car industry. I've also spent quite a few years in the media industries working with primarily newspaper companies. Well, it's an interesting question, and the whole notion of what to call the customer and what vocabulary to use, that seems to be an ongoing concern with some of our clients.
Yeah.
I tend to use clients for our customers, but mostly my clients use customers for their customers. So I think customer is sort of the main word to use, and of course we elaborate a lot on that depending on, they might be students, or they might be patients, or they might be collaborators or partners or whatever. So really we're across the board as to vocabulary. It really is down to the client to sort of choose a vocabulary that fits his or hers or their context. So no clear answer on that. But I think if you have to go with one word, I'd definitely go with customer before client. Looking at how relationships have changed and how they are changing, well, that is a massive question to address in 1 minute or two. But I think there are a couple of things that are happening, and I'll talk about this now from a slightly theoretic standpoint. And I think the main change is that we're moving from a world where the customer was considered an object or a recipient of the products or services or art or whatever that we were producing, into a world where the customer is more of a subject or a co-creator or a collaborator who is actively involved in sort of crafting or designing the customer experience. So that is a fundamental change, and through that change, I think what is also happening is that we have to get rid of a lot of the sort of marketing and sales and entrepreneurship thought models that we've been developing over the last 30, 40 years or so, because most of them were theoretically anchored in a world where the customer was sort of distant from the producer, and that was sort of a byproduct, I think, of the industrialization era, where sort of the age of the middleman, where it all of a sudden became sort of rational and profitable and relevant to sort of have the middleman sort of in between the producer and the consumer, be it a grocery store or be it a clothing store or be it an arts agent or whoever, or in whatever industry we're working in. Now that is changing, and it's changing due to a number of issues. Of course, globalization and the sort of the abundance of choice that we face as consumers, whatever needs we might have. That's certainly one thing. The other one, definitely technology, and the fact that through internet, through social media, through various means of interaction, we now can access products, services, compare alternatives in a much easier manner than we used to. So I think globalization and technology are sort of the macro factor from sort of outside that are sort of enabling the subjectivation of the customer, if you wish. Then again, we have what sociology professor Anthony Elliott, who we do a lot of work with at the University of South Australia, calls new individualism and reinvention, which is essentially the notion that we as individuals, be it consumers or just human beings as such, we tend to sort of continuously reinvent and redevelop and reshape and redesign who we are, our identity, how we are perceived through the outer public, who we are, and that's sort of an ongoing concern. And I think what we buy and what we don't buy is sort of a major sort of point or a major means for sort of enabling the continuous redesign and reinvention of our personal lives. So all this all together, to get back to your question, sort of drives the notion of the customer no longer being the passive recipient of whatever a company or an organization does, to being an active collaborator or co-creator of the value or the product of the service. We have been through an age of sort of individualism now, and I'm not talking about sort of the 80s individualism, which was by and large about I, me and myself, but rather a sort of conscious, collaborative individualism, if you wish. So it's not either or, it's both. And I see nothing that would sort of stop that trend from sort of continuing. Then again, I think as consumers, and we see that with our clients, consumers face now an abundance of choice and an abundance of alternative, no matter if you want to choose a bank or you want to choose a car or you want to choose your grocery store or you want to choose a school. So options abound, and when options abound and people get confused, which a lot of consumers do, you tend to sort of start sorting and you start sort of opting out of things. And I think we'll see a lot more of that, looking as to sort of how future consumerism might head, is sort of people opting out, choosing not to buy something or choosing not to do this or do that, just due to the fact that time is a scarce resource, and the scarcity of time balanced with the constant sort of need and urge to reinvent forces us to sort of leave some things undone or unbought, if you wish. Yeah, well, looking at the client case that we're into right now, which is the museum, and another sort of reference point would be the newspaper industry. I think those are two good examples of industries or practices where customers are already co-creating or collaborating. So it's not a matter anymore of whether they will do it or not. They're already there, and I think to some extent the whole arts have been sort of at the forefront of that development, sort of leaving the old notion of the customer being an object or a recipient of something to some extent. So we're seeing a lot of that, and it is causing quite a lot of pain to our clients, because it is a new way of thinking about things, because customers don't behave sort of rationally always. They don't always do what the supplier wants them to do, or behave, or use the channels, or pay the price that the supplier wants them to do. So sort of combining the notion of collaboration, co-creation with the notions of reinvention and new individualism makes a sort of a hefty stew, if you wish, if you want to develop customer relationships. But what we're seeing now, and what we're doing, for instance, with the museum, is sort of actively trying to move away from the idea of a museum being a place, normally a physical place, where experts gather some sorts of material or insights or inputs and put them on display as the experts for the ignorant consumer to come and sort of look at and perhaps interact with and consume in a fairly traditional manner. So if you move away from that standpoint and viewing the idea of a museum not as a place but rather as a state of mind, and the role of the museum is not to be the place where experts gather stuff for people to look at, but the role of the museum is rather to be where the people is. So get out of the actual physical building into the virtual world, into the real life of people in cities and towns and libraries and wherever that might be, and sort of changing the whole physical locus of where the museum sort of interacts with the customer. And if you do that, if you sort of leave the domain where the museum has traditionally been sort of in control of the whole customer experience and move into places where customers first of all, behave irrationally at times, and second of all, don't always obey. Then it becomes much more challenging, but then again, the experience for the customer becomes that more sort of rewarding and much better on the whole. So we're doing a lot of work on that, not knowing where it's heading yet, but we're talking about, you know, events of all sorts. We're talking about working with you know, schools, with kids, with elderly, with cities, sort of bringing together various customer groups that normally don't meet within the confines of a museum, so to speak. Being involved in numerous sort of values projects or initiatives over the years, I think the whole notion of the sort of the meaning of the importance of values is also changing. I mean, in the old world, as an organization, I think the standard procedure was that you could, as an organization, as a company, create your own set of values and sort of impose them on your customers just by you know, by means of traditional communications, saying this is who we are, this is what we stand for, and take it or leave it, essentially. And I think through what we talked about previously, through an increased sort of collaborative sort of stance with customers, through the abundance of choice, I think we have to approach values in a slightly different manner. So you can't really sort of decide on an organization's or an artist's values in isolation from your customers. I think you have to have a much more sort of elaborate and tighter dialogue, if you wish, with your customers about what drives their behavior and what their needs are, and what in sort of what situations they think that my company is relevant. So the whole notion of values has to be sort of defined in interaction with the customers, not as a sort of inside-out exercise. I think that would be my first point. Then again, I think as to a byproduct of sort of globalization and the IT revolution is, of course, increased transparency, which also leads to the fact that the customer now defines your values. You cannot define them yourself, irrespective of whether you're an entrepreneur or an artist or a bank or a car company. And we see that happen a lot. I mean, look at Uber might be a good example now as we speak. I mean, the hyped company that sort of outcompeted taxis all over the world, and a great example of the sharing or platform economy, if you wish. And all of a sudden it seems that some of the senior execs at Uber aren't the good guys that we thought they were. And all of a sudden the whole thing just starts disintegrating and breaking down, just due to the fact that you can't stop it anymore. And you are transparent. So if your guys within your company, be it, or organization, be it large or big, if they don't sort of live your values, or if they aren't transparent, people will find out sooner or later, and then you'll have a hard time recovering. So transparency, I think, is also driving the notion that we have to sort of co-create values with customers as well. I think it is a sensitive topic, and I mean, back to the museum, I mean, that's a typical, I mean, the museum is filled with, you know, experts within their own domains. You know, they're PhDs in art history, they are PhDs in sociology and whatever, and they have all the knowledge of sort of how a traditional museum works and should work, and the whole domain, and as you said, the words that you use and the vocabulary and the discourse is quite sort of museum specific. And now that we're sort of moving out of that domain into what might be perceived and certainly is a sort of a more commercial approach, if you wish, where we reach out to new audiences, we do stuff outside the museum. It's easy to see that some individuals are having a really hard time with that, because you have to sort of opt into a new vocabulary, a new discourse, a new way of thinking, where you are for good reasons. It's not your home turf. You're not used to the vocabulary. You feel at times slightly uncomfortable with the whole situation, because it's something way different than what you've been doing for the last 20-25 years. And that's, I think it's a good conflict. I thrive a lot personally in those situations where sort of people are sort of hit in the head by new ideas and new concepts that sort of are strange and unfamiliar to them. And bearing in mind, okay, I did go to a business school, but I wouldn't consider myself a business person by sort of standard means or definitions. So I think if you can sort of find something fruitful in that cultural clash between, say the business world and the entrepreneurial world and the arts world, there's a lot sort of to find in that, and there's a lot in that can sort of, I think, help artists, help cultural institutions sort of reinvent and grow. And I think what sort of, I tend to look at things from the customer side and the customer point of view. And what we know about customer experience is for instance, that customers compare across industries. So if I meet an artist, or if I go to an exhibition and the exhibition is great, I not only do I compare it to other art exhibitions, I also compare it to my last visit to the IKEA furniture store, to the grocery store, to the rock concert that I went to in Berlin last week, to the restaurant visit that I had last weekend, and so on and so forth. So consumers sort of don't dissect their personal lives into industries. So now here's the art Ralf, and here's the business Ralf, and here's the rock and roll Ralf and whatnot. So we tend to compare our experiences across the board. And I think that being, I think, a given now, I think most researcher would sort of buy that idea by now. Then if you encounter an industry that sticks to the knitting and says, hey, we're so special, and we don't use, that and that vocabulary, and we don't use that thing, and we don't want to engage with our customers, it really doesn't work that well anymore. So you have to adapt to the fact that customers are changing. And as customers are changing, so you have to kill some of your darlings by way of how you approach what business you're in, or what industry you're in, or what's the role of art, or what's the role of culture in general. And the byproduct of that is the blending of vocabulary and the blending of discourses. And I think that's altogether healthy. That's a big question again, but I mean, just reflecting on entrepreneurship as such, and despite graduating from a business school, I didn't learn a single thing essentially about entrepreneurship, even in a business school. And I'd be hard pressed to think that art students or cultural students in general learned that much of entrepreneurship either. And I think that is really, really a waste of energy, because in the world that we live in, many of us, much more people than previously, will end up as entrepreneurs, either within their own companies, or as sort of entrepreneurs, or people having an entrepreneurial mindset within the organizations where they work. So I think that sort of skill set and that mindset will be required much more in the future than it has been up until now. And we haven't done a really, really great job of addressing that, I think, in schools or at universities up until now. I think a lot of the skills that we sort of think are important are more or less perceived as being default, or being a necessity for sort of playing the game at all. So I mean, I might, think that my greatest skills are having written quite a few books, and having done these and those seminars, and having done these and those projects. But then again, when I talk to customers, they talk about my sort of presence in with them and with their people, and in projects in much more sort of softer terms. So it's about, am I fun to work with? Am I sort of challenging? Do people leave the projects or leave the meetings with new ideas, or do they leave bored, or do people feel energized around me? So those sorts of issues that are really, really hard to measure, that are intangible for sure, and that has nothing to do with whatever the small print says on my business card that I'm supposed to be all about. So I think then again back to sort of what people value. A lot of sort of the hard stuff is taken for granted, but it's really the sort of soft stuff that makes you stick out. And I think that probably goes for all entrepreneurs. That's a good question, and I think the notion of freedom is changing also. I suppose way back when the idea of freedom was sort of artistic freedom in the sense that you were able to distance yourself from the outer world and sort of look into yourself and find your true inner means or drivers and express that through whatever, being an artist or being a painter or writer or whatever. And I think the whole idea of refraining or withdrawing from the outer world and finding your integrity through sort of being alone, that's probably going out the window as well. So I think we have to sort of redefine artistic freedom within the confines of again, repeating myself, I know, but co-creation, collaboration, individualism and reinvention. So I think whatever you do, you cannot rely on sort of being detached from the outer world. You probably have to be prepared to interact with the outer world to a much larger extent than we might have done previously. But then again, looking back at sort of how, at least most artists that I know and follow, of those who still are alive, they tend to be much more collaborative and much more co-creative in the work they do, be they painters or rock bands or writers or whatever. And I think that's just that's a byproduct of the fact that the world is changing.